The Henley Regatta Revenge. Good evening, I'm Stephen, and welcome to Cozy Mysteries. Tonight, I invite you to join me on the sun-dappled banks of the Thames, where the elegant world of competitive rowing conceals a heart as dark as the river's depths. This is the story of how a champion's triumph became his epitaph, and how one man's pursuit of justice transformed into something far more sinister. Chapter 1. A Fatal Stroke. The morning of Thursday, July the 4th, dawned with that peculiar English brightness that makes everything appear as though viewed through polished glass. The Henley Royal Regatta was in its fourth day, and the riverside town hummed with anticipation. Striped marquees lined the banks, their pennants snapping in the breeze, while rowing enthusiasts in blazers and boating hats claimed their vantage points early. Among the spectators was a small man with an egg-shaped head and a magnificent moustache, so meticulously groomed it might have been painted on. Hercule Poirot sat in a folding chair beneath a white parasol, observing the proceedings with the same intensity others reserved for matters of national importance. Beside him, Captain Arthur Hastings fidgeted with his programme, periodically standing to scan the crowd. "Really, Poirot," Hastings remarked, "you might show a bit more enthusiasm. My nephew Roger is competing in the Thames Challenge Cup this afternoon. Splendid young man, finest stroke in his college." "But of course, mon ami," Poirot replied, his eyes never leaving the river. "I am most enthusiastic. See how I observe every detail, every preparation. The rowing, it is like the crime detection, no? Everything must be in perfect order, perfect timing, perfect execution." Hastings laughed. "I hardly think we'll find any crimes here, old fellow. This is Henley, not some sordid London back alley." "Crime, my friend, exists wherever there are human beings, and where there is competition, there is jealousy. Where there is jealousy, there is motive." Poirot adjusted his parasol by precisely 2 degrees. "But you are right to think that today shall be pleasant. The sun, it shines. The river, it sparkles. What could possibly disturb such perfection?" The answer came at precisely 2:15 p.m. during the semi-final of the Grand Challenge Cup, the regatta's most prestigious event. The British crew, favoured to win, had taken an early lead. Their boat sliced through the water with mechanical precision, 8 oars rising and falling in flawless synchronization. In the bow seat sat Jonathan Ashford Smythe, Olympic gold medalist and the crew's powerhouse. His name appeared frequently in the society pages, always accompanied by flattering photographs and mentions of his successful investment banking career. At 36, he remained at the peak of physical condition, his athletic achievements a cornerstone of his professional reputation. Poirot watched through opera glasses borrowed from a nearby spectator. "Observe, Hastings, the rhythm. See how each man moves as part of a single mechanism. It is beautiful, is it not?" Then something changed. Ashford Smythe's oar caught awkwardly in the water. His body lurched forward, then slumped backward. The boat's perfect synchronization shattered. The crew veered toward the bank, oars clashing as teammates shouted in confusion. "Good God!" Hastings leapt to his feet. "Something's wrong." Poirot was already moving, his small legs carrying him with surprising speed toward the finish line where officials were scrambling. By the time they arrived, rescue boats had pulled Ashford Smythe from the water. He lay on the dock, his face grey, his breathing shallow and irregular. A regatta physician worked over him frantically, but even from a distance Poirot could see the truth in the doctor's expression. Jonathan Ashford Smythe died at 2:22 p.m., 7 minutes after collapsing. Chapter 2. The Physician's Puzzle. The regatta's medical tent had been transformed into a makeshift examination room. Dr. Bernard Crawley, the event's chief physician, stood beside the shrouded form of Jonathan Ashford Smythe, his face etched with professional bewilderment. "I simply don't understand it," Dr. Crawley said, addressing the small group that had assembled. Besides Poirot and Hastings, there was Detective Inspector Marsh from the Thames Valley Police, 2 regatta officials, and Ashford Smythe's devastated teammates. Mr. Ashford Smythe was in perfect health. I examined him myself just 2 days ago, routine medical screening for all competitors. His heart was absolutely sound. "Yet his heart has failed," Poirot observed quietly, his green eyes fixed on the physician. "This is certain." Cardiac arrest during extreme physical exertion, Dr. Crawley confirmed. It happens, though rarely in someone so young and fit. Perhaps an undetected congenital condition or, Poirot prompted. The doctor hesitated. I'd like to wait for the post-mortem before speculating further. Inspector Marsh, a solid man with the weathered face of someone who spent his career dealing with Thames Valley's relatively mundane crimes, cleared his throat. Tragic accident, obviously. These things happen. Still, we'll need statements from everyone who was near him today. Standard procedure. Poirot said nothing, but his fingers tapped a precise rhythm against his walking stick. Hastings recognized the gesture. His friend was thinking, and when Hercule Poirot thought in that particular way, it usually meant he had detected something others had missed. Monsieur l'Inspecteur, Poirot said eventually, you will permit that I ask some questions. I have no official capacity, of course, but my friend Captain Hastings, he has brought me to enjoy the rowing, and now I find I cannot enjoy it until I understand what has happened. Marsh looked doubtful, but one of the Regatta officials, Sir George Pemberton, chairman of the organising committee, intervened. I know your reputation, Monsieur Poirot. If you believe there's something suspicious here, I'd rather know sooner than later. The Regatta's reputation is at stake. Very well, Poirot agreed. First, Dr. Crawley, tell me please, when exactly did Mr. Ashford Smythe eat his last meal? The doctor consulted his notes. According to his teammates, he had a light breakfast at 8 a.m., then nothing solid until after the race. Athletes at this level follow very specific nutrition protocols. However, he did consume a supplement shake at approximately 1:45 p.m. A shake? Poirot's eyebrows rose. What was in this shake? Protein powder, electrolytes, various vitamins. Completely standard for elite athletes. The team's nutritionist prepared it according to Ashford Smythe's usual formula. And who is this nutritionist? One of the teammates stepped forward, a lanky young man with reddish hair. That would be Sophie Thornton. She's only been with us for 3 weeks. Our previous nutritionist quit rather suddenly. Sophie came highly recommended. Recommended by whom? Actually, by Martin Pemberton. He's a sports nutritionist who works with several rowing clubs. Used to row himself quite successfully. He suggested Sophie when our old nutritionist left. Said she was top-notch. Poirot's eyes gleamed. This Martin Pemberton, he is here at Henley? Oh yes, he's consulting for the Cambridge crew. You can probably find him near their tent. Most interesting, Poirot murmured. Hastings, perhaps we should speak with this Monsieur Pemberton, and with the young lady Sophie Thornton as well. As they departed the medical tent, Hastings whispered, You don't really think this was anything other than natural causes, do you? Poirot stopped walking and turned to his friend. Hastings, consider, a supremely fit athlete screened as healthy just 2 days ago, dies of cardiac arrest at exactly the moment when his heart is under maximum stress. The timing, it is too perfect, too precise. But good Lord, Poirot, who would want to kill him? And how could anyone time a heart attack so exactly? Ah, my friend, those are indeed the questions. But I tell you this, if someone wished to murder an athlete during competition, they would need to understand 2 things. First, the poison. What substance could cause cardiac failure during extreme exertion but appear natural? Second, the physiology, how to time the poison's effect to coincide with maximum cardiac stress. This requires not just malice but knowledge, specialized knowledge. A chill ran down Hastings's spine despite the warm July afternoon. You're saying someone actually planned this? To kill him during the race itself? I am saying, Poirot replied carefully, that we must consider the possibility. Come, let us find these people who prepare the supplements for athletes. The little grey cells, they tell me that perhaps something not quite right was added to Monsieur Ashford Smythe's nutritious shake. Chapter 3, the tour. Nutritionist's account. Sophie Thornton proved to be a young woman of perhaps 28, with a practical manner and an air of quiet competence. They found her in a small tent near the British crew's headquarters, surrounded by bottles, measuring equipment, and precisely labelled containers. When Poirot introduced himself and explained his interest, she blanched visibly. "This is absolutely awful," she said, her hands trembling slightly as she set down a protein shaker. "Jonathan seemed perfectly fine when I prepared his supplement. He even joked with me, asked if I'd put in any magic ingredients to help him beat the Cambridge boat." "Tell me please, Mademoiselle Thornton," Poirot said gently, settling himself on a folding stool. Exactly what you put in this supplement shake and when. Sophie took a steadying breath and consulted a small notebook. I prepared it at 1:40 p.m., 5 minutes before Jonathan arrived to collect it. The formula was specific to his requirements: 25 grams of whey protein isolate, 5 grams of branched-chain amino acids, a half teaspoon of magnesium citrate, a quarter teaspoon of potassium chloride, and 12 ounces of filtered water. Everything was measured precisely. And these ingredients, where do they come from? The containers are kept in a locked cabinet. Only I have the key. Well, I am the team manager. All supplements are tested for banned substances regularly. We're extremely careful about that. One positive test could disqualify the entire crew. Who gave you this formula? Poirot asked. It came from Martin Pemberton. He'd been consulting with the team before I took over, and he provided detailed nutritional profiles for each rower. He was actually incredibly helpful when I first started. Showed me the specific timing protocols for pre-race supplements, explained how different substances affect athletic performance at different stages of digestion. Poirot's green eyes sharpened. So, this Martin Pemberton, he knew exactly what Monsieur Ashford Smythe would consume, and exactly when. Well, yes, I suppose so. But Martin is one of the most respected nutritionists in British rowing. He works with multiple teams. He'd have no reason to... Sophie's voice trailed off as the implication became clear. You can't possibly think Martin had anything to do with this. I think nothing yet, mademoiselle. I merely establish facts. Tell me on race day who had access to the ingredients you used. Sophie considered. In theory, only me and the team manager, Richard Whitmore. But the cabinet isn't exactly Fort Knox. Anyone who knew where I kept the key could have accessed it. I usually keep it in my bag, which sits in this tent. And people are in and out of here all day. Teammates, coaches, officials. Was anyone in the tent around 1:30 or 1:40 today? I don't think so, but I can't be certain. I stepped out for about 5 minutes around 1:25 to get some fresh water. When I returned, everything looked exactly as I'd left it. Poirot nodded slowly. And this formula from Monsieur Pemberton, it has been used for how long? For all 3 of Jonathan's races this week. He's had the same supplement shake before each race. Same formula, same timing. No problems until today. After thanking Sophie and requesting that she not mention their conversation to anyone, Poirot and Hastings walked toward the Cambridge tent, where Martin Pemberton was supposedly working. What are you thinking? Hastings asked. I am thinking, mon ami, that someone who had access to Mademoiselle Sophie's ingredients, who knew the exact formula and timing, and who understood exercise physiology well enough to predict maximum cardiac stress during a race, such a person could commit a very clever murder indeed. And I'm thinking that we must now meet this Martin Pemberton, former rower, and see what he has to tell us about his former rival, Jonathan Ashford Smythe. Rival? Hastings said sharply. You know something about their history. Poirot's smile was enigmatic. Let us say that during our walk I may have asked a few questions of people we passed. The rowing community, it is small. Everyone knows everyone's history. And the history between Pemberton and Ashford Smythe, it is most illuminating indeed. Chapter 4. The Saboteur's Shadow. Martin Pemberton was a man who wore disappointment like a second skin. Tall and still muscular despite being in his mid-30s, he had the kind of perpetually injured expression that comes from dreams destroyed and opportunities lost. When Poirot and Hastings found him in the Cambridge crew's tent, he was reviewing nutrition logs with an assistant, but his eyes kept drifting toward the river, where races continued despite the tragedy. Martin Pemberton? Poirot inquired politely. I am Hercule Poirot, and this is Captain Hastings. Might we have a few moments of your time? Pemberton glanced up, and something flickered across his face. Recognition, perhaps, or wariness. The detective. I've read about you. Bit unusual to find you at Henley. Unless... His expression shifted. This is about Jonathan, isn't it? They think it wasn't natural causes. I ask questions only, Poirot said mildly. I understand you were once a competitive rower yourself. Once. The word carried decades of bitterness. 8 years ago, I was favourite for the Olympic team. Then everything fell apart during the final trials. Equipment malfunction. My rudder connection failed, boat went off course, race was over. Just like that, my Olympic dream ended. How unfortunate, Poirot murmured. But surely such malfunctions, they happen. Not like this one. Pemberton's voice hardened. The connection didn't just fail, it had been deliberately weakened. Someone filed through part of the metal housing. It was subtle, designed to break under racing stress. By the time I proved what had happened, the Olympic team was already selected. Jonathan Ashford Smythe took the spot that should have been mine. Hastings leaned forward. Are you saying Ashford Smythe sabotaged your equipment? I'm saying he paid someone to do it. Took me years to prove it, but I finally tracked down the boatyard worker who did the job. Old man named Fletcher. He was dying, wanted to clear his conscience, made a full recorded confession 2 months before he passed away. Jonathan paid him £5,000 to weaken my rudder connection, just enough that it would fail during maximum racing stress. And did you confront Monsieur Ashford Smythe with this evidence? Poirot asked quietly. Pemberton laughed bitterly. 2 weeks ago, here at Henley during the preliminary rounds, showed him the recording, the photographs Fletcher had kept. Thought maybe he'd do the decent thing, confess, apologise, offer some kind of compensation for what he'd cost me. You know what he did? He laughed. Said Fletcher's confession was worthless, the old man had been senile. I had no proof that would stand up in court. Then he threatened to sue me for defamation if I made any of it public. Poirot tilted his head, bird-like. And how did this make you feel, monsieur? How do you think it made me feel? Pemberton's hands clenched. I lost everything because of his cheating. My Olympic spot, my rowing career, my athletic scholarships. I ended up with severe depression, attempted suicide, spent 2 years barely functional. Meanwhile, he used his fraudulent Olympic gold to build a banking career worth millions. The credentials that got him every client, every partnership, all built on sabotaging my dreams. Yet here you are, Poirot observed, working as a sports nutritionist, helping other athletes achieve what was denied to you. That shows admirable character, does it not? Or it shows I had no other options, Pemberton said flatly. This is the only world I know, the only world I've ever known. When you're groomed from age 12 to be an Olympic rower, and that gets stolen from you, what else is there? I understand, Poirot said softly, that you recommended Sophie Thornton to replace the previous nutritionist on Monsieur Ashford Smythe's crew. Why would you help the man who had destroyed your life? Something shuddered in Pemberton's expression. Professional courtesy. Sophie's talented, and the British team needed someone quickly. Despite my personal feelings about Jonathan, I wouldn't want the other 7 rowers to suffer from poor nutrition. How noble, Poirot said, and Hastings couldn't tell if he was being sincere or sarcastic. Tell me, Monsieur Pemberton, where were you this morning between 1 o'clock and 2 p.m? Here, mostly. I was with the Cambridge crew going over their pre-race meal plans. Probably a dozen witnesses. He paused. But I'm sure you'll check that. And I'm sure you're wondering whether I had anything to do with Jonathan's death. The answer is no. Despite everything he did to me, I'm not a murderer, though I'd be lying. If I said I was sorry, he's dead. After they left the Cambridge tent, Hastings exploded. Good Lord, Poirot. He's practically admitted to having motive. The man destroyed his life, refused to make amends, and Pemberton is a nutritionist who knew exactly what Ashford Smythe would consume and when. It's obvious. Perhaps too obvious, Poirot mused, watching Pemberton through the tent's opening. The nutritionist had slumped in his chair, staring at nothing. But yes, the motive is strong, the opportunity existed, and the knowledge required that he certainly possesses. But we must consider all possibilities before we leap to conclusions. What other possibilities are there? The little grey cells, they suggest several things, my friend. Come, let us speak with the teammates. I wish to understand who Jonathan Ashford Smythe truly was. Chapter 5. The Champion's Character. The British rowing crew had sequestered themselves in a private tent, away from the curious crowds and persistent journalists. They sat in various states of shock and grief, their race uniforms still damp from the water. When Poirot and Hastings entered, the conversation died. Richard Whitmore, the team manager, rose to greet them. He was a sturdy man in his 50s, with the weathered hands of someone who'd spent his life around boats and water. Monsieur Poirot, I was told you might want to speak with us. I'll help however I can, though I still can't believe Jonathan is gone. He was in perfect health. Perfect. That is what troubles me, monsieur, Poirot replied, settling himself on a wooden bench. In my experience, healthy men of 36 do not simply collapse and die during athletic events. So I ask myself, what changed? What was different today? And I must also ask, who was Jonathan Ashford Smythe truly? The question hung in the air. The rowers exchanged glances, and finally one of them spoke, the red-haired young man they'd met earlier, whose name was Thomas Becket. He was complicated, Monsieur Poirot. Brilliant rower, absolutely brilliant. But as a person, he trailed off. Please, continue, Poirot encouraged. I seek truth, not flattery. Another rower spoke up, a stocky man named David Winters. Jonathan was ruthless, in rowing, in business, in everything. He won his Olympic gold 8 years ago, and he's been leveraging that success ever since. Every client he brings to his investment bank, every partnership he forms, it all starts with Jonathan Ashford Smythe, Olympic gold medalist. He turned athletic achievement into currency. But there were rumours about that Olympic victory, were there not? Poirot asked gently. The rowers shifted uncomfortably. Thomas Becket finally spoke. There were always whispers about the trials, about how some of his competitors had strange equipment failures. Martin Pemberton's rudder, for one. Another rower's oars mysteriously cracked during warm-ups. But nothing was ever proven, and by the time investigations started, the Olympics were over. Did you believe these rumours? I didn't want to, Thomas admitted, but 3 months ago I found something in Jonathan's gym bag. A bottle of EPO, erythropoietin. It's a banned substance, increases red blood cell count, improves endurance. He was doping. And what did you do with this information? I confronted him privately, told him he needed to stop or I'd report him. Know what he said? That everyone dopes, that the only difference between winners and losers is who's smart enough not to get caught. Then he reminded me that if I reported him, the whole team would be tainted. We'd all be investigated. Our reputations destroyed. He had me trapped. Poirot nodded slowly. So you kept his secret to protect yourselves? I know how that sounds, Thomas said miserably, but the rest of the crew is clean. We train hard, we follow the rules. Why should their lives be ruined because Jonathan was a cheat? And were you angry, monsieur? Angry enough to want him dead? Thomas's face went white. My God, no. I was angry, yes, but I couldn't. Of course not, Poirot said soothingly. I ask only to understand. Tell me, who else knew about the EPO? Just me and Jonathan. At least I thought it was just us. But... Thomas hesitated. Last week I saw Martin Pemberton talking to Jonathan after a preliminary race. They were arguing about something, and I heard Martin say, I know what you're taking. I know everything you've done. I couldn't hear Jonathan's response, but he looked furious. Interesting, Poirot murmured. And did Monsieur Ashford Smythe seem worried in recent days? Nervous? Anxious? David Winters answered. The opposite, actually. He seemed confident, almost cocky, like he'd won some great victory. It was his usual attitude when he'd closed a major business deal. Poirot stood, brushing invisible lint from his perfectly pressed trousers. Messieurs, I thank you for your honesty. One final question. Did any of you notice anything unusual about Jonathan's behaviour this morning? Anything at all out of the ordinary? The rowers thought. Then Thomas spoke carefully. Now that you mention it, he seemed oddly nervous about his supplement shake. Usually he just downs it without thinking, but today he asked Sophie twice if she'd made it exactly to his usual specifications, and he insisted on watching her prepare it. Did he indeed? Poirot's eyebrows rose. Most curious. And after drinking it, did he comment on the taste? He said it tasted slightly bitter, different from usual. Sophie explained she'd used a new batch of protein powder. He seemed satisfied with that explanation. As they left the tent, Hastings grabbed Poirot's arm. The plot thickens considerably, doesn't it? Like the fog on the Thames, mon ami, we have multiple people with motives. Pemberton for revenge, Thomas for honour, perhaps others we have not yet discovered. We have suspicious behaviour from the victim himself, and we have a bitter taste in a supplement shake that usually tastes normal. The picture, it becomes clearer, but also more complicated. What do we do now? Poirot consulted his watch. Now, my friend, we wait. The post-mortem results should be available within the hour, and those results, I suspect, will tell us not just how Jonathan Ashford Smythe died, but will point us toward who killed him. Chapter 6. The Beta Blocker Revelation. Dr. Crawley's expression was grave when he summoned them to the medical tent an hour later. Inspector Marsh was already there, looking considerably less confident about his tragic accident theory. "Gentlemen," Dr. Crawley began without preamble, "the post-mortem has revealed something extraordinary. Jonathan Ashford Smythe died of cardiac arrest. Yes, but it was chemically induced. His blood contained a massive dose of propranolol, a beta-blocker medication." "Beta-blocker?" Hastings echoed. "Isn't that for heart conditions?" "Among other things," Poirot interjected softly. "Please continue, Doctor." "Beta-blockers slow the heart rate and reduce blood pressure," de Crawley explained. "In normal circumstances, they're perfectly safe, even beneficial for people with hypertension or certain cardiac conditions. But during extreme physical exertion, like an Olympic-level rowing race, a beta-blocker overdose would be catastrophic. The drug prevents the heart from speeding up to meet the body's oxygen demands. During maximum athletic effort, the combination would cause cardiac arrest almost inevitably." "How much propranolol was in his system?" Poirot asked. "Approximately 300 milligrams. A therapeutic dose is typically 40 to 80 milligrams. This was enough to cause severe bradycardia, dangerously slow heart rate, and the exertion of racing would have finished the job." Inspector Marsh cleared his throat. "So, we're definitely looking at murder. The question is, how was he dosed? When? And by whom?" "The timing is crucial," Poirot said, his green eyes thoughtful. "Beta blockers are absorbed relatively quickly, with peak blood levels occurring about 30 to 90 minutes after oral administration. The race began at 2:15, and Monsieur Ashford Smythe collapsed approximately 7 minutes later. Working backwards. His supplement shake," Dr. Crawley finished. "He consumed it at 1:45. That would put peak absorption right in the middle of the race." "Precisely." Poirot turned to Inspector Marsh. "You will, of course, want to analyse the remaining ingredients in Mademoiselle Thornton's supplies, and you will want to investigate who had access to beta-blockers. They are prescription medications, yes?" "Yes, but not particularly difficult to obtain," the inspector admitted, "especially for someone in the medical or sports medicine field. We're talking about millions of prescriptions written annually in the UK alone." "Then perhaps," Poirot suggested delicately, "we should determine which of our suspects has been prescribed propranolol recently. That would narrow the field considerably, would it not?" Within 2 hours, Inspector Marsh had obtained the necessary medical records through emergency warrants. The results were delivered to them in the Regatta's administration office, where they'd established a temporary command post. "Martin Pemberton," Marsh read from the report, "was prescribed propranolol 3 years ago for anxiety following his suicide attempt. And here's something interesting. He refilled the prescription just 3 weeks ago, a 90-day supply." "How convenient," Hastings murmured. "Or how damning." "But is it not too convenient?" Poirot objected. "A clever murderer would surely not use their own prescription medication so easily traced back to themselves. Unless," he trailed off, thinking. "Unless what?" Marsh prompted. "Unless they did not care about being traced, or unless they believed the death would appear natural, requiring no investigation. Or," Poirot's eyes gleamed, "unless someone wished for Monsieur Pemberton to appear guilty." "You're suggesting someone framed him?" "I suggest we consider all possibilities. Tell me, Inspector, who else among our circle of suspects might have legitimate access to beta-blockers?" Marsh consulted his notes. "Thomas Beckett has no prescription. David Winters was prescribed them briefly 2 years ago for performance anxiety, but there's no record of recent refills. Sophie Thornton has never been prescribed propranolol. Richard Whitmore, the team manager, was prescribed them 5 years ago for hypertension, but switched to a different medication 3 years ago." Poirot stood and began to pace, his hands clasped behind his back. "So we have Pemberton with recent access, and Whitmore with historical but not current access. But let me pose a question. How does one administer 300 milligrams of propranolol without the victim noticing?" "The bitter taste," Hastings said suddenly. "Thomas mentioned that Ashford Smythe complained his shake tasted bitter today." "Exactly. Propranolol has a bitter taste. To disguise it in a supplement shake would require some skill, but it is certainly possible, especially if one knows the usual flavor profile well enough to match it. The victim notices something is off but accepts the explanation of a new batch of protein powder. So the killer had to have knowledge of supplement preparation, Marsh concluded. That points us towards someone in the sports nutrition field. Or someone who has worked closely with such people, Poirot added. Someone who has learnt the protocols, the procedures, the precise timing that athletes follow. Someone like Monsieur Pemberton. Should I arrest him? Marsh asked. Not yet, Poirot said firmly. We have evidence of means and opportunity, yes, but I am not yet satisfied that we understand the whole picture. There are still pieces missing from this puzzle, and until we find them, we risk arresting the wrong person, or at least not understanding the full truth of what happened here. Chapter 7. The Supplement Switch. The next morning found Poirot, Hastings, and Inspector Marsh in Sophie Thornton's supplement preparation area, which had been sealed off as a crime scene. Forensic investigators had worked through the night, and their findings painted an interesting picture. The protein powder container, the lead forensic investigator explained, showing them an evidence bag, contains traces of propranolol. Someone ground up approximately 10 or 12 tablets and mixed them into the powder. The distribution is uneven, most of the drug concentrated near the top, suggesting it was added recently and not thoroughly mixed. Which means, Poirot observed, that the person who added it did not have much time. They could not risk mixing it properly, which might have involved dumping out the entire container and remixing, something that would have taken time and increased the risk of discovery. Exactly. We estimate the tampering occurred within 12 hours of the victim consuming the shake, probably the night before or the morning of the race. Poirot turned to Sophie, who sat white-faced and trembling in the corner. Mademoiselle, you kept the ingredients locked in a cabinet, yes? Who else had access to the key? Richard Whitmore, the team manager, and, she hesitated, and Martin Pemberton. When he was helping me set up my procedures 3 weeks ago, I gave him a spare key. He suggested I keep one hidden nearby in case I ever lost mine or needed someone to access supplies in an emergency. I didn't think anything of it at the time. He's so respected in the field. Where was this spare key hidden? Marsh asked sharply. Taped under the table where I do my prep work. Martin said it should be somewhere accessible but not obvious. Hastings couldn't contain himself. Poirot, surely this clinches it. Pemberton had access to the key, the opportunity to tamper with the powder, and his own supply of propranolol. We should arrest him immediately. But Poirot held up one finger. Patience, mon ami. Consider, if Monsieur Pemberton was clever enough to plan this murder with such precision, timing the drug's absorption to peak during maximum cardiac stress, understanding athletic physiology well enough to predict the exact outcome, would he then be so foolish as to leave evidence that points directly to him, his own prescription, his own keys, his own recommendation of the nutritionist? Maybe he was arrogant, Marsh suggested, thought he was too smart to be caught. Or maybe, Poirot countered, someone else is very clever indeed. Someone who understood that Pemberton would be the obvious suspect given his history with the victim. Someone who carefully constructed a trail of evidence leading directly to him. But who? Hastings demanded. Who else had motive, means, and opportunity? Poirot's eyes gleamed. That, my friends, is what we must discover. Inspector, I would like to conduct an experiment. Can you gather all of our suspects? Pemberton, Thomas Beckett, David Winters, Richard Whitmore, and Sophie Thornton in one place? I wish to stage what you English call a reconstruction. A reconstruction? Of what? Of the morning of the murder. I wish to see exactly how everyone moved, where they were, what they did. Sometimes, mon ami, the truth reveals itself not in what people say, but in what they do, in how they move through space, in tiny inconsistencies between memory and reality. The little grey cells, they tell me we are missing something obvious, and perhaps seeing everyone together will illuminate what that something is. An hour later, the group had assembled in the tent area. Poirot had them arranged precisely as they had been on the morning of the murder, according to their statements. Martin Pemberton stood near the Cambridge tent, approximately 50 yards from Sophie's preparation area. Thomas Beckett and David Winters were positioned near the British crew's tent, 40 yards in the opposite direction. Richard Whitmore stood near the now, Poirot announced. I want each of you to walk through your movements between 1 p.m. and 2 p.m. on the day of the race. Move as you moved then. Do exactly what you did then. I will observe. Martin Pemberton went first, walking from the Cambridge tent toward the river, consulting with an imaginary crew, reviewing notes. His path never brought him within 20 yards of Sophie's preparation area. Thomas Beckett and David Winters demonstrated their pre-race warm-up routine, stretching, light jogging, checking equipment. Again, their paths didn't naturally intersect with Sophie's tent. Richard Whitmore's reconstruction was more interesting. As team manager, his duties had him moving constantly between different areas, checking boats at the dock, speaking with officials, coordinating with coaches. His route took him past Sophie's tent 3 times between 1 o'clock and 1:45. "Monsieur Whitmore," Poirot said softly, "you passed Mademoiselle Sophie's area 3 times. Did you enter the tent on any of these occasions?" "Once briefly, around 1:20. I needed to check something on the nutrition log. Sophie was there, preparing shakes for the other rowers. I was in and out in less than a minute." "And where was Mademoiselle Sophie when you entered?" Whitmore thought carefully. "She was at the prep table measuring out ingredients. Her back was to me." Poirot turned to Sophie. "You remember this, mademoiselle?" "Yes," Richard came in briefly. "I was focused on making sure the measurements were exact. I didn't pay much attention to him." "I see." Poirot walked slowly around the tent, his eyes taking in every detail: the locked cabinet, the prep table, the layout of equipment. Then he stopped, his gaze fixed on something beneath the prep table. "Hastings, if you would be so kind as to look under that table and tell me what you see." Hastings knelt down and peered underneath. "There's nothing here, Poirot, just dust and, wait, there's tape residue. Where the spare key was hidden, presumably." "Precisely. Tape residue but no key. Mademoiselle Sophie, when did you last see the spare key in its hiding place?" Sophie's brow furrowed. I'm not sure. I never actually used it. I checked for it once, maybe a week ago, just to make sure it was still there. It was." "And you, Monsieur Pemberton, when did you last see it?" "I haven't looked for it since I suggested she hide it there 3 weeks ago," Pemberton replied. "Why would I? I have no reason to access her supplies." "Yet someone removed it," Poirot observed, "and that someone must have done so recently enough that Mademoiselle Sophie did not notice its absence before the murder, which suggests the theft occurred within the past week." He began to pace, his hands behind his back, his magnificent moustaches quivering slightly. "Let us consider the psychology of our killer. This was not a crime of passion, not a sudden impulse. This was carefully planned, precisely executed. The murderer needed several things: access to propranolol, knowledge of athletic nutrition and physiology, opportunity to tamper with the supplement powder, and, most crucially, the ability to time the poison's effect to occur during maximum cardiac stress." "All of which points to Pemberton," Marsh interjected. Yes, it points to him most conveniently. Too conveniently. But I ask you to consider another possibility. What if someone understood that Pemberton would be the obvious suspect? What if someone deliberately created a trail of evidence leading to him, knowing his history with the victim would make him the perfect scapegoat? "But who?" Hastings asked, frustrated. "Everyone else's movements are accounted for. The only person with clear opportunity is Pemberton." "Are they indeed accounted for?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Let me pose a question. Monsieur Whitmore, when you entered Mademoiselle Sophie's tent at 1:20, how long did you say you were inside?" "Less than a minute. Just long enough to check the log." "And Mademoiselle Sophie, you confirm this?" "Yes, he was very quick." "Yet," Poirot said softly, "when I measure the distance from the tent entrance to the nutrition log, which sits on the far table, and then time how long it takes to walk there, review the log and return, even moving quite quickly, it takes approximately 90 seconds, not less than a minute. A small discrepancy, perhaps, but discrepancies interest me." Whitmore's face remained impassive. "I'm estimating, Monsieur Poirot. I wasn't watching a stopwatch." "No, of course not. But I wonder, might you have been inside longer? Might you have had time to, say, open the locked cabinet, for which you, as team manager, have a key, and add something to the protein powder?" The tent fell silent. Everyone stared at Richard Whitmore, who slowly smiled, a cold, mirthless expression. "And why," he asked calmly, "would I want to kill Jonathan Ashford Smythe? He was our star rower, the crew's best chance at winning. His banking connections brought sponsorship money to the team. What possible motive could I have?" "Ah," said Poirot, "that is indeed the question. And the answer, I believe, lies not in what Monsieur Ashford Smythe had done, but in what he was about to do. Inspector Marsh, have you finished examining the victim's personal effects and documents? Marsh nodded slowly. We have. There was something odd in his hotel room, a draft letter to the British Rowing Federation. Never sent, but clearly being prepared. And what did this letter contain? Allegations of systematic doping in British rowing, names of athletes, coaches and officials who he claimed were involved in or turning a blind eye to performance-enhancing drug use. He was threatening to expose the whole system unless certain demands were met. Blackmail, Hastings breathed. Precisely, Poirot confirmed. And among the names in that letter, I suspect we will find that of Richard Whitmore. Am I correct, Inspector? Marsh consulted his notes. Yes. Ashford Smythe specifically mentioned that Whitmore had facilitated doping by altering drug testing schedules and misplacing samples that would have shown positive results. All eyes turned to Whitmore, whose expression had hardened into stone. This is absurd, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. You can't possibly— But I can, Poirot interrupted gently. And I will explain exactly how you committed this murder, Monsieur Whitmore. You will find that when I begin to explain, the truth has a way of becoming undeniable. Chapter 8. The Manager's Motive. Poirot gestured for everyone to sit, arranging them in a semicircle as though they were pupils, and he their teacher. The July sun cast long shadows across the tent, and somewhere in the distance the sounds of continued regatta activities seemed jarringly inappropriate given the gravity of the moment. Let me tell you a story, Poirot began, about a man who dedicated his life to British rowing. Richard Whitmore, respected team manager, trusted official, someone who has worked with Olympic athletes for 20 years, a man whose entire identity is bound up in the success of British rowing. Whitmore said nothing, but his jaw was clenched tight. But this man has a secret, Poirot continued. For years he has been helping certain athletes cheat. Not all athletes. No, he is selective. Only those he believes have the potential to win, to bring glory to British rowing. He alters testing schedules. He ensures certain samples are lost or contaminated. He provides access to banned substances. All for the greater good as he sees it. All to ensure British crews stand on the Olympic podium. This is pure speculation, Whitmore said harshly. Is it? Then explain to me, monsieur, why Jonathan Ashford Smythe's draft letter contains such specific details about your activities. Explain why he mentions dates and competitions where samples went mysteriously missing. Explain why he describes the exact process by which you would inform certain athletes when they would be tested, giving them time to cycle off prohibited substances. Jonathan was a liar and a cheat himself. Everyone knows he doped. Ah, but there is a French saying, set a thief to catch a thief. Monsieur Ashford Smythe was indeed a cheat, but that gave him the knowledge to recognize other cheaters, and more importantly, it gave him leverage. He knew your secrets, Monsieur Whitmore, and he intended to use them, not to expose corruption, but to extort money and favours. Inspector Marsh leaned forward. We found evidence of that too. Email drafts on his laptop. He was demanding £50,000 from Whitmore in exchange for keeping quiet. £50,000, Poirot echoed. A fortune for most, but perhaps manageable for a man in Monsieur Whitmore's position. But it was not really about the money, was it, monsieur? It was about the threat of exposure hanging over your head forever. Today, 50,000, tomorrow another demand, and another after that. Blackmailers never stop. They always come back for more. Whitmore's silence was telling. So you decided he must die, Poirot continued. But you are clever, monsieur. You understood that if Ashford Smythe died under suspicious circumstances, you would be investigated. You needed his death to appear natural, or if that was impossible, you needed someone else to take the blame. Enter Martin Pemberton, perfect scapegoat. Former rival with known grievances, sports nutritionist with access to supplements and drugs, man with his own prescription for the very medication you plan to use. How convenient. This is nonsense, Whitmore said, but sweat had appeared on his forehead. Is it? Let me tell you how you did it, monsieur, and you will see how the facts align perfectly with my theory. 3 weeks ago, when the previous nutritionist quit suddenly, And I wonder, did you perhaps encourage that departure? You arranged for Martin Pemberton to recommend Sophie Thornton, a talented but inexperienced young woman who would trust your judgment and follow protocols without questioning them. Sophie gasped. You used me? I'm afraid so, mademoiselle. You were the unwitting instrument of murder. Monsieur Whitmore knew that Pemberton would help you set up your procedures, would provide nutrition plans, would even suggest hiding a spare key to the ingredient cabinet. All innocent actions that would later appear deeply suspicious. But, Hastings interjected, how did Whitmore get Pemberton's propranolol prescription? He didn't need to, Poirot said simply. He obtained propranolol through his own means, perhaps with a false prescription, perhaps purchased illegally, perhaps even taken from his own old prescription that he claimed was no longer refilled. The medical records show he was prescribed propranolol 5 years ago. Who is to say he did not keep some tablets or obtain more through unofficial channels? That's a reach, Poirot, Marsh objected. Perhaps, but consider, when we arrest Monsieur Whitmore and search his home, I predict we will find propranolol there, possibly in a medicine cabinet, possibly hidden more carefully, but it will be there. I am certain of it. Whitmore's face had gone pale, but he still said nothing. The execution was simple, Poirot continued. You waited until the morning of the race. You knew Sophie's routines, knew exactly when she would prepare Ashford Smythe's supplement shake. You entered her tent at 1:20, ostensibly to check the nutrition log. Sophie was busy with her preparations, her back turned. You had your own key to the ingredient cabinet. You opened it, added ground propranolol tablets to the protein powder, closed the cabinet. The whole operation took perhaps 30 seconds, well within the less than a minute you claimed to be inside the tent. But, Thomas Becket spoke up, confused, if Whitmore added the propranolol that morning, why did Jonathan's shake taste bitter? Wouldn't Sophie have noticed the tampering when she scooped out the powder? An excellent question, and one that initially puzzled me as well. But remember, Mademoiselle Sophie told us that the propranolol was not evenly mixed into the powder, most of it concentrated near the top. This suggests it was added recently and not thoroughly mixed. But here is the crucial detail. Monsieur Ashford Smythe's supplement was the first one prepared that day. So when Sophie scooped protein powder from the container, she got the concentration of propranolol that Whitmore had sprinkled on top. By the time she prepared supplements for the other rowers later, she was scooping from deeper in the container, where there was little or no contamination. The logic was crystalline, undeniable. Even Hastings, who often struggled to follow Poirot's reasoning, could see how perfectly the pieces fit together. You are a detective, Monsieur Poirot, Whitmore said finally, his voice hollow. Not a judge. You have a theory, but can you prove any of this? But I can, Poirot replied softly. You see, you made one critical mistake. When you ground up the propranolol tablets to mix into the protein powder, you needed a tool, a mortar and pestle perhaps, or something similar. And when you crushed those tablets, tiny fragments scattered, invisible to the naked eye but detectable with forensic analysis. Inspector Marsh, if you examine Monsieur Whitmore's office, his desk, his personal effects, I predict you will find traces of propranolol. Not enough to notice casually, but enough for chemical analysis to detect. The drug leaves residue, you see. It is very difficult to clean away completely. Marsh nodded slowly. We can certainly test for that. And there is one more thing, Poirot added. When you removed the spare key from beneath Mademoiselle Sophie's table, you did so to make it appear that Pemberton had taken it, one more piece of evidence pointing toward him. But you forgot something, monsieur. You forgot about fingerprints. The tape that held the key, it has been preserved as evidence, and I'm quite certain that when it is analysed we will find your fingerprints on it, not Monsieur Pemberton's. For a long moment, Whitmore sat frozen. Then slowly, his shoulders slumped. The defiance drained from his face, replaced by a terrible weariness. He was going to destroy everything, Whitmore said quietly. 20 years of work. 20 years of building British rowing into a world power. Jonathan didn't care about any of that. He just wanted money, wanted to leverage his knowledge into more wealth. He was going to expose the entire system, ruin countless athletes' careers, all for his own profit. So you took justice into your own hands, Poirot said, not unkindly. I did what was necessary. For the sport. For the athletes who'd worked so hard. For Britain. And for yourself, Poirot added. Let us not pretend this was entirely altruistic, monsieur. You facilitated doping to create winners, yes, but you also profited from those winners. In reputation, in influence, in the satisfaction of being the man behind the champions. And when Jonathan threatened to expose you, it was not just the sport you were protecting, it was your legacy, your identity, your entire life's work. Whitmore said nothing. Inspector Marsh stood and gestured to the constables who'd been waiting outside. Richard Whitmore, I'm arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Jonathan Ashford Smythe. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defence if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence. As the constables led Whitmore away, Martin Pemberton stood up, his face a mixture of relief and residual anger. He tried to frame me, Pemberton said. He knew about my history with Jonathan, knew I'd be suspected. He was going to let me hang for murder. Yes, Poirot agreed. And I'm sorry that you were made to suffer under that suspicion, even briefly. But you must understand, monsieur, your own actions made you vulnerable to such manipulation. Your confrontation with Ashford Smythe, your recorded threats, your public anger, all of this created the perfect conditions for someone to use you as a scapegoat. I never would have killed him, Pemberton insisted. Despite everything he did to me, I wouldn't have murdered him. I believe you, Poirot said simply. Revenge is a powerful emotion, but there is a vast distance between wishing someone dead and actually killing them. Most people, thankfully, cannot cross that distance. As the group began to disperse, still reeling from the revelations, Poirot turned to Hastings. Come, mon ami, I believe our work here is done. Let us leave the Thames and return to London, where I hope the criminals are less ingenious and the murders less athletically complicated. But Hastings could see that despite his light tone, Poirot was troubled. What's bothering you? He asked as they walked toward the car park. Justice, Hastings. It bothers me, as it always does in such cases. Ashford Smythe was a blackmailer and a cheat. Whitmore was a facilitator of doping and a murderer. Pemberton was a victim of sabotage who nursed his grievance for 8 years. In this story, where are the heroes? Where are the innocent? Sport was meant to be noble, to bring out the best in human character. Instead, I find only corruption, revenge, and murder. There's Sophie, Hastings offered, and the other rowers, like Thomas. They're innocent in all this. Perhaps, Poirot conceded, but even they were touched by the corruption, forced to make impossible choices between their own integrity and the success of their team. This is what troubles me most, mon ami. How one man's cheating cascades outward, creating ripples that touch everyone around him. Ashford Smythe sabotaged Pemberton's career, and that act of sabotage ultimately led to his own death. Cause and effect, action and reaction. Evil begets evil, always. They drove back to London in contemplative silence, the green Thames countryside sliding past the car windows. Behind them the Henley Regatta continued, crews rowing and racing as though nothing had happened, as though the murder had been merely a brief interruption in the pageantry of British sport. But, for those who'd been involved, Hastings knew, nothing would ever be quite the same. The shell of sporting nobility had been cracked open, revealing the less savoury truths beneath. And that, perhaps, was the real tragedy of the whole affair. Chapter 9. The Confession Complete. 3 days later, Poirot and Hastings sat in their London rooms, reading the newspaper accounts of Whitmore's confession. As Poirot had predicted, the forensic evidence had been overwhelming. Traces of propranolol had been found on Whitmore's desk and in his office at the rowing club. His fingerprints were on the tape that had held the spare key. Most damningly, a search of his home had uncovered a bottle of propranolol tablets, 90 pills, enough for a full prescription, hidden in a locked drawer. Under the weight of evidence, Whitmore had confessed fully. The newspapers quoted extensively from his statement. Jonathan Ashford Smythe had become a cancer in British rowing. He had cheated his way to Olympic glory, then used that glory to build a fortune while threatening to expose others who had bent the rules. He contacted me 6 weeks ago with his demands, £50,000 immediately, and more later. He said if I didn't pay, he would release evidence of my involvement in facilitating doping. I tried to reason with him. I explained that the athletes I'd helped were genuinely talented, that the doping merely leveled the playing fields against international competitors who were using far more sophisticated programs. But he didn't care. He saw only an opportunity for profit. I couldn't let him destroy 2 decades of work. I couldn't let him ruin the careers of athletes who'd trained their entire lives for glory, and I couldn't face the shame of being exposed as a cheat. So I planned his death. I knew Martin Pemberton had a history with Jonathan, that he'd make a perfect suspect. I knew the team's nutritionist was inexperienced and wouldn't notice subtle tampering. I had my own supply of propranolol. I'd continued to fill prescriptions for it over the years, claiming I still needed it for blood pressure, though I rarely took it. I ground up the tablets and added them to the protein powder on the morning of the race. I timed it precisely. I knew Jonathan would drink his supplement shake at 1:45 p.m. I knew the race would start at 2:15. I understood that beta blockers reach peak blood levels about 30 to 60 minutes after ingestion, which would put maximum effect right in the middle of the race. During extreme cardiac stress, with his heart unable to speed up due to the medication, cardiac arrest was inevitable. I thought it would look natural. I thought maybe there would be no investigation at all. And if there was, I thought Pemberton would take the blame. I had created a perfect trail of evidence pointing to him, his prescription, his access, his motive. I never expected Hercule Poirot to be present. I never expected anyone to look closely enough to see past the obvious suspect to the truth beneath. The confession went on, detailing the systematic doping he'd facilitated over the years, not just for Ashford Smythe, but for dozens of athletes. The scandal was rocking British rowing to its foundations. Several coaches had already resigned. Multiple athletes were under investigation. The sport's governing body had announced a comprehensive review of anti-doping procedures. "Quite the mess you've uncovered," Hastings observed, setting down the newspaper. "British rowing may never recover." "Perhaps that is not entirely a bad thing," Poirot replied. "Sometimes a system must be torn down before it can be rebuilt properly. The corruption had gone too deep, lasted too long. Better to expose it and start fresh than to let it continue festering beneath a veneer of sporting nobility. Still, I can't help feeling sorry for the innocent athletes caught up in this. Thomas Beckett, for instance. He trained honestly, rode clean, and now his achievements will always be tainted by association. C'est vrai, but he will survive, I think. The truly innocent always do eventually. They rebuild their reputations through continued integrity. It is harder than if they had never been tainted, yes, but possible. Hastings poured them both tea, a comfortable ritual that helped process the complexities of the case. What about Pemberton? The papers say he's been completely exonerated, even receiving apologies from those who suspected him. As he should be. He was a victim twice, once of Ashford Smythe's sabotage and again of Whitmore's frame-up. I'm glad we were able to clear his name before he was formally charged. That at least is some small justice in this affair. Do you think he'll find peace now, knowing that his saboteur is dead and his would-be framer is in prison? Poirot considered the question carefully. I do not know, mon ami. Revenge, even when delivered by another's hand, does not truly heal old wounds. He has lost 8 years of his life to bitterness and depression. Those years cannot be returned to him. Perhaps Ashford Smythe's death will give him closure, or perhaps it will simply be another tragedy layered onto the first. Time will tell. They sat in silence for a moment, sipping their tea. Then Hastings asked the question that had been troubling him since the case concluded. Poirot, do you think Whitmore was right? About levelling the playing field, I mean. If every other country's athletes are doping, doesn't that put clean British athletes at a disadvantage? Ah, Hastings, that is the eternal question of competitive sport, is it not? The ends versus the means, the victory versus the integrity of the victory. Poirot set down his teacup with his characteristic precision, aligning it exactly on its saucer. I will tell you what I think. I think that the moment we say everyone else is cheating, so we must cheat too, we have already lost something more valuable than any medal. We have lost the reason for competing at all. But isn't winning the point of competition? No, mon ami, winning is the goal, but it is not the point. The point is to test oneself, to discover the limits of human capability, to strive for excellence within the rules. When we remove the rules, when we say anything is permissible in pursuit of victory, we turn sport into mere spectacle. We make athletes into chemists rather than competitors, and we make the medals meaningless. Yet Whitmore would argue that his athletes were still talented, still had to train and work hard. And he would not be entirely wrong, but he misses the essential truth. The foundation was corrupt, and therefore everything built upon it was unstable. Ashford Smythe's Olympic gold, what did it mean when it was earned through sabotage and doping? Nothing, less than nothing, because it was built on deception. And Whitmore's entire career, all his achievements, what do they mean now that we know he facilitated cheating? Again, nothing. Hastings nodded slowly, understanding. So, in trying to protect his legacy, he destroyed it more completely than any exposure ever could have. Précisément. This is the tragedy of such men. They believe they are serving some greater good, but in reality they serve only their own egos, their own need to be associated with winners. And when that service requires them to compromise their principles, they tell themselves noble lies about leveling playing fields and protecting innocent athletes. But underneath, there is only selfishness and fear. Fear of irrelevance, fear of failure, fear of being forgotten. And murder, Hastings added quietly. Yes, and murder, the ultimate expression of that selfishness and fear. Whitmore could not bear the thought of his legacy being destroyed, so he destroyed a human life instead, and in doing so, he destroyed his legacy far more completely than any blackmail ever could have. A knock at the door interrupted their philosophical discussion. Mrs. Hudson, their landlady, entered with a visitor's card on a tray. "A Miss Sophie Thornton to see you, Mr. Poirot. She says you'll remember her from the Henley affair." "But of course, please, show her in." Sophie entered a moment later, looking far more composed than when they'd last seen her. The terror and confusion had been replaced with a quiet determination. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings," she began, taking the seat Poirot offered. "I wanted to thank you personally for clearing up this dreadful business. I've been having nightmares about being an unwitting accomplice to murder." "You were a victim, mademoiselle, not an accomplice," Poirot assured her. "You must not burden yourself with guilt for another man's crime." "I know, intellectually, but emotionally—" She trailed off, then straightened her shoulders. "Anyway, I've made a decision. I'm leaving sports nutrition. I can't continue in a field where I might be used as a tool for cheating or worse. I've enrolled in a pharmacy program instead. If I'm going to work with supplements and medications, I want to do it in an environment with proper oversight and ethical standards." "A wise choice," Poirot approved, "and one that shows strength of character. Many would simply try to forget and move on. You are choosing to learn and grow from the experience." "I wanted to ask you something, though," Sophie continued. "How did you know it was Whitmore? What made you suspect him specifically when everyone else was so focused on Pemberton?" Poirot smiled. "Several small things, mademoiselle. First, the psychology. Whitmore's devotion to British rowing was so extreme, so all-consuming, that I recognized it as a potential source of dangerous obsession. Men who define themselves entirely by one thing become capable of terrible acts when that thing is threatened. Second, the evidence against Pemberton was too perfect, too obvious. In my experience, obvious suspects are often red herrings. A truly clever murderer does not commit crimes that point directly back to themselves. They create trails that point to others. Third, there was Whitmore's opportunity. He alone had a legitimate reason to be in the supplement preparation area, to access the locked cabinet, to handle the ingredients without arousing suspicion. He could commit the tampering openly, disguised as routine team management duties. And finally, there was his reaction when I mentioned the timing discrepancy, how long he claimed to be in Sophie's tent versus how long it actually took to check the nutrition log. He hesitated just slightly, and I saw fear in his eyes. That told me he was hiding something about those crucial moments. "All of that from such small clues," Sophie marvelled. "The little grey cells, they notice everything," Poirot replied with a touch of pride. "It is merely a matter of paying attention, of trusting one's instincts while also verifying them through logic and evidence." After Sophie departed, thanking them profusely and promising to send updates about her new career path, Poirot and Hastings returned to their tea and newspapers. But Hastings could tell his friend was still troubled. "What is it, Poirot? The case is solved, the murderer confessed. Justice has been served. Why do you still look so dissatisfied?" Because, mon ami, justice and satisfaction are not always the same thing. Yes, Whitmore will go to prison for murder. Yes, the doping scandal has been exposed and reforms are being instituted. But what of Martin Pemberton? He has lost 8 years of his life to depression and bitterness over an injustice that can never be repaired. What of the athletes who doped at Whitmore's encouragement? Many of them are young, barely adults told by authority figures that everyone does it, that it's the only way to compete. Are they criminals or are they victims? And what of Jonathan Ashford Smythe himself? Yes, he was a blackmailer and a cheat, but did he deserve to die for it? Should murder be the punishment for extortion? Of course not, Hastings said firmly. No matter what Ashford Smythe did, Whitmore had no right to kill him. Exactly. Yet I cannot help but think that if Ashford Smythe had been stopped 8 years ago, if his sabotage had been properly investigated and punished, none of this would have happened. Pemberton would have his Olympic glory. Ashford Smythe would be in prison for sabotage rather than dead by murder, and Whitmore would not have been put in the impossible position of being blackmailed over his own corruption. You can't prevent every crime by solving earlier ones, Hastings objected. No, but I can lament the cascading failures that led to this particular tragedy. That is what troubles me most about this case, Hastings. It was so preventable. At every stage, if someone had acted with integrity rather than self-interest, the disaster could have been averted. But no one did. Not Ashford Smythe, who chose sabotage over fair competition. Not the officials who chose to ignore suspicions of cheating rather than investigate thoroughly. Not Whitmore, who chose to facilitate doping rather than insist on clean sport. Not Pemberton, who chose to nurse his grievance for 8 years rather than find a way to move forward. Each person made understandable choices, choices driven by ambition or fear or wounded pride. But those choices compounded layer upon layer until murder became not just possible but somehow inevitable. That is what I find so deeply unsatisfying about this case, mon ami. It is a tragedy not of fate or accident, but of repeated human failures. Hastings had no answer to that. He simply nodded and poured them both more tea, and they sat together in the gathering dusk, contemplating the uncomfortable truths that murder always reveals about human nature. Chapter 10. The Thames Flows On. 2 weeks after Richard Whitmore's arrest, Poirot received an unexpected letter. It came on heavy cream-coloured paper, the handwriting elegant and controlled. When he opened it, he found it was from Martin Pemberton. "Listen to this, Hastings," Poirot said, adjusting his reading glasses. "Dear Monsieur Poirot, I write to thank you once again for clearing my name in the death of Jonathan Ashford Smythe. Since our last conversation, I have done a great deal of thinking about my life, my choices, and my future. You said something that has stayed with me, that revenge, even when delivered by another's hand, does not truly heal old wounds. You were right. Jonathan's death has brought me no peace. If anything, it has made me realize how much of my life I've wasted in bitterness and anger. I've decided to leave sports nutrition. Like Sophie Thornton, I find I can no longer work in a field so tainted by corruption. Instead, I'm going to use the settlement money I received from the British Rowing Federation. They quietly paid me a substantial sum to avoid a lawsuit over their failure to properly investigate the sabotage 8 years ago, to start a foundation for young athletes. The foundation will provide support for rowers who've been injured or whose careers have been derailed through no fault of their own. We'll offer counselling, career guidance and financial assistance. We'll help them understand that their identity need not be tied solely to athletic achievement, that there is life beyond sport. I cannot get back my lost 8 years, but perhaps I can help others avoid losing theirs. Perhaps that is a better revenge than any I could have planned, to take the pain I suffered and transform it into something that helps others. Thank you again for your wisdom and your detective work. You saved me from being convicted of a murder I didn't commit, but more importantly, you helped me see that my real enemy was never Jonathan Ashford Smythe. It was my own inability to move past what happened to me. I hope that in helping others I can finally move past it myself. With sincere gratitude, Martin Pemberton." Poirot set down the letter with a satisfied expression. "Voila! Perhaps some good will come from this tragedy after all." "That's remarkably noble of him," Hastings observed, "using his settlement to help others rather than simply pocketing it." "It is also psychologically sound," Poirot noted. The best way to heal one's own wounds is often to prevent similar wounds in others. Monsieur. Pemberton has discovered this truth for himself. I am pleased for him. What about the others? Have you heard anything more about the case? Oui. Inspector Marsh telephoned yesterday with updates. The investigation into doping in British rowing continues. They have identified 17 athletes who are using prohibited substances with Whitmore's assistance over the past decade. Most will receive suspensions rather than lifetime bans, as the authorities recognise that many were pressured into it by coaches and officials. That seems fair, Hastings said. They were victims as much as perpetrators. Precisely. Thomas Beckett, by the way, has been completely cleared of any wrongdoing. He testified fully about discovering Ashford Smythe's EPO and about the pressure he felt to remain silent. The Rowing Federation has commended him for his eventual honesty and integrity. And Ashford Smythe's banking firm? There is an interesting development. His partners at the investment bank have issued a statement distancing themselves from his alleged improprieties. They are careful with their words, those bankers. They have announced a review of all deals that Ashford Smythe brought to the firm, checking for any conflicts of interest or fraud. Several clients have already withdrawn their accounts, fearing contamination by association. So his legacy is being dismantled piece by piece. As it should be. A legacy built on fraud deserves no better fate. Poirot stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the London street below. You know, Hastings, this case has made me think deeply about the nature of competition and corruption. We lionize winners in our society, but we do not always ask how they won. We celebrate achievement, but ignore the methods that produced it. You sound like you're writing a moral philosophy treatise, Hastings said with a smile. Perhaps I should, but no, I'm merely observing that this case represents a larger truth about human nature. When we make winning the only thing that matters, when we tell people that second place is simply first loser, when we create systems where success is rewarded so extravagantly that failure becomes unbearable, we create the conditions for corruption. But surely some competition is healthy. It drives people to excel, to push boundaries. Of course, competition can bring out the best in humanity: courage, dedication, perseverance, grace under pressure. But it can also bring out the worst: cheating, sabotage, violence, murder. The question is how we structure our competitive systems to encourage the former while discouraging the latter. Hastings considered this. And how would you structure them? First, by remembering that sport is ultimately just a game. Yes, an important game, a beautiful game, but still a game. It is not worth dying for, and it is certainly not worth killing for. Second, by celebrating not just winners, but all those who compete with integrity. Third, by investigating accusations of cheating swiftly and thoroughly, so that they do not fester for years into violent revenge. And finally, by helping athletes understand that their value as human beings is not determined solely by their athletic achievements. That last point is particularly important, I think, Hastings mused. Both Pemberton and Ashford Smythe seemed to define themselves entirely through rowing. When that was threatened, for Pemberton by sabotage, for Ashford Smythe by potential exposure, they couldn't cope. Exactly. And Whitmore was the same. His entire identity was wrapped up in being the man behind British rowing success. When that identity was threatened by blackmail, he committed murder rather than face its loss. These are not psychologically healthy relationships with sport. A comfortable silence fell between them as they contemplated these weighty matters. Then Hastings asked, "Will you go back to Henley next year?" Poirot shuddered dramatically. "Mon Dieu, non. Once was quite sufficient, I assure you. The murder, the doping, the corruption, all of this I can handle with professional detachment. But the wasps, Hastings, the terrible wasps that plagued us that day, they are far more frightening than any murderer." Hastings laughed. "You're impossible, Poirot. You solve murders with genius, but run from insects like a child." "Everyone has their weaknesses, mon ami. Mine happens to be flying, stinging creatures. I make no apologies." He returned to his chair and picked up his teacup, examining it critically before taking a sip. "Besides, I think perhaps it is better if I do not attend Henley next year. Let the regatta return to being about rowing, about sport, about the simple pleasure of watching boats race on a beautiful river. Let my presence there be forgotten so that the shadow of this murder can fade. That's surprisingly humble of you. I have my moments, Poirot replied with a small smile. Though do not expect such humility to become habitual. The little grey cells, they are still quite magnificent, and I see no reason to pretend otherwise. Another knock at the door interrupted them. Mrs. Hudson appeared again, this time bearing a telegram on her tray. "Just arrived for you, Mr. Poirot." Poirot opened it and read quickly, his eyebrows rising. "Ah, it is from Sir George Pemberton, no relation to Martin, I believe, the chairman of the Henley Regatta organising committee. He writes to thank me for my discretion in handling the case and to offer me an honorary membership in the Leander Club, one of the most prestigious rowing clubs in England. I am to be given lifetime access to their facilities and invited to all future regattas as an honoured guest." "Will you accept?" Hastings asked. "But of course. I may not wish to attend future regattas, but it costs nothing to accept the honour. And who knows? Perhaps in future years, when the memory of this tragedy has faded and the reforms have taken root, I might enjoy watching some rowing races. From a distance, you understand, where there are fewer wasps." Hastings shook his head affectionately. "You're incorrigible." "I prefer to think of myself as charmingly eccentric," Poirot corrected. He set down the telegram and steepled his fingers, his expression growing serious once more. "But in all seriousness, mon ami, this case has reminded me why I do this work. It is not for the fame, though that is pleasant enough. It is not for the intellectual challenge, though I confess I do enjoy that. It is because the world is full of people like Whitmore, people who convince themselves that terrible acts are justified by noble goals. And the world needs people who will look past the stated justifications to the ugly truth beneath." "The little grey cells, you mean?" "The little grey cells, yes, but also the moral clarity to call evil by its name, regardless of how it dresses itself. Whitmore believed he was serving British rowing. Perhaps in some twisted way he believed he was even a patriot, but he was a murderer, and no amount of noble rhetoric changes that fact. My job is to strip away the rhetoric and reveal the murder, and that, my friend, is what I shall continue to do for as long as the little grey cells continue to function." "Which will be forever, I'm sure," Hastings said dryly. "We can but hope." Poirot raised his teacup in a mock toast, "to the little grey cells and to justice, however complicated and unsatisfying it may sometimes be." They drank to that, and as the afternoon light faded into evening, they sat together in companionable silence, two friends who had witnessed humanity's capacity for both corruption and redemption, and who would continue to do so for many years to come. And so, dear listeners, we come to the end of our story. The Henley Regatta Revenge, a tale of sabotage and blackmail, of doping and murder, of justice delayed and revenge denied. As in all the best mysteries, the truth was there from the beginning, waiting to be discovered by someone with the patience to look past the obvious and the wisdom to understand human nature's darker corners. Richard Whitmore sits in prison now, his legacy destroyed more thoroughly than any blackmailer could have managed. Martin Pemberton has found a new purpose, transforming his pain into help for others. The young athletes continue to row, some chastened by scandal, others inspired to compete with integrity. And the Thames flows on, indifferent to human drama, carrying boats and secrets downstream just as it has for centuries. This is Stephen, signing off from Cozy Mysteries. Remember, the truth is like a rower's stroke. It requires timing, precision, and the courage to push through resistance. Until our next mystery, keep your eyes sharp and your grey cells sharper. Good night.